The moment you are in right now, the one defined by the challenges that feel largest, most consuming, most relentless in their demand on everything you have, is not a detour from the life you are meant to be living. It is, in a very specific and very precise psychological sense, the threshold of it. Jung's framework for understanding why the human psyche develops the way it does offers something that most popular accounts of challenge and growth do not. Not the reassurance that things will get better, but an actual structural explanation for why the biggest challenges in a person's life are so consistently and so specifically followed by the biggest breakthroughs. That explanation is what this video is about, and it changes the relationship to the challenge you are in. If this is the kind of understanding you have been looking for, not comfort, but an actual framework for what is happening and why, subscribe to this channel. This is where that depth lives. What most frameworks for understanding challenge offer is a version of the same basic idea. Difficulty is followed by growth because adversity builds resilience, because struggling develops capability, because what does not destroy you makes you stronger. These observations are not wrong, but they are incomplete in a way that leaves out the most important part. They describe the outcome without explaining the mechanism. They tell you that challenge produces growth, but not why. Not the specific psychological process by which something as unwanted and as painful as a serious challenge in a person's life becomes the precise instrument through which the next significant development of that person becomes possible. Jung's framework does not simply describe the outcome. It explains the mechanism. And the mechanism, once understood, changes how the challenge is experienced from the inside. The phrase, "about to," in the title of this video, is not optimism and not consolation. It is a description of something structural, something that happens in the psyche when a challenge of sufficient magnitude has been genuinely engaged rather than primarily resisted or avoided. In Jung's understanding, the psyche is not a passive system that simply endures what life delivers and gradually recovers. It is a purposive system, a system with its own internal developmental logic, its own orientation toward specific outcomes, and its own mechanisms for producing those outcomes in response to what experience provides. When those mechanisms are understood, the relationship between big challenges and big breakthroughs ceases to be a hopeful observation and becomes something that can be recognized as operating with a degree of precision in one's own specific situation. There is a distinction that Jung's framework makes, consistently and with practical importance, between challenges that pass through a person's life without producing fundamental change and challenges that become the instrument of genuine development. The distinction is not primarily in the intensity or duration of the challenge itself. Challenges of comparable external severity can produce radically different interior outcomes, depending on the degree to which the person encountering the challenge is able to engage with what the challenge has activated in their interior, rather than simply focusing all available resources on resolving the external circumstances. The challenge that passes through without producing fundamental change is one that was survived from outside. The challenge that becomes a breakthrough is one that was also engaged from inside, where the interior work the challenge demanded was genuinely done. But here is the specific mechanism that makes this work, the one that the Jungian framework identifies with a precision that most accounts of challenge and growth do not reach. And it is almost never what people expect. It is not primarily about attitude. It is not about reframing the challenge as an opportunity. It is not about willpower or resilience in the ordinary sense of those words. It is about something structural, something that happens in the architecture of the psyche when a challenge of the right magnitude engages the right dimensions of the interior. Understanding it does not make the challenge easier, but it changes the nature of the relationship to what is being endured, and that change in relationship is frequently what makes the difference between a challenge that passes and a breakthrough that arrives. A significant personal challenge, the kind that feels largest, most destabilizing, most capable of disrupting the existing structure of how the person understands themselves and their life, is not simply an external circumstance that requires a practical response. It is, in Jung's framework, simultaneously a psychic event, something happening at the level of the psyche that has its own distinct character and its own distinct consequences, independent of and more significant than the external circumstances that produced it. At the level of the psyche, a serious challenge is characterized by one consistent feature. It exceeds what the current configuration of the ego can absorb without reorganization. It is, by definition, something that the existing self cannot manage in the existing way. And this excess, this precise point at which the existing configuration reaches its limit, is exactly where the development begins. One of the most practically significant concepts in Jung's framework for understanding where serious challenges come from and why they are rarely accidental is the compensatory function of the unconscious. In Jung's model, the unconscious is not simply a repository of repressed material. It is an active, intelligent system that monitors the one-sidedness of the conscious attitude and produces, in response to that one-sidedness, compensatory material, content, images, symptoms, and, when the one-sidedness is sufficient and the internal communication is ignored, circumstances that force the confrontation that the conscious mind was avoiding. The serious challenge that appears to arrive from outside, the career crisis, the relational breakdown, the health emergency, the financial collapse, frequently has a compensatory dimension. It is the unconscious's way of delivering the confrontation that the conscious attitude was organized to prevent. The concept of the self, capitalized in Jungian psychology to distinguish it from the ego, the conscious center of personality, is the organizing principle of the entire psyche, not merely its conscious portion. The self, in Jung's framework, has its own developmental logic, a teleological orientation toward the fullest possible expression of the individual's nature across the entire arc of the life. The ego's plans, the conscious goals, the deliberate strategies for how the life should proceed, these are real and relevant, but they are not the only organizing force operating in the life. The self is also at work, and when the challenges that arrive in a person's life are examined in retrospect from the vantage point of what they produced, they tend to display a precision that the ego's own planning cannot fully account for. They targeted with remarkable accuracy exactly what needed to change. Jung's concept of the complex, a charged cluster of associations and memories organized around a specific emotional theme, operating with semi-autonomous energy in the unconscious, is directly relevant to understanding what serious challenges activate and why they have the psychological force they do. Every significant challenge constellates a complex. It engages with emotional charge, the specific interior wound, the unresolved developmental issue, the accumulated shadow material that the challenge is precisely configured to surface. This is why the same external circumstance produces such radically different interior experiences in different people. The challenge does not produce its effect through its external characteristics alone. It produces its effect through what it activates, what it brings into psychic play from the depths of the individual's specific interior history. And what it activates is never accidental. The challenges that feel biggest, the ones that target the areas of life that matter most, that threaten what was most relied upon, that destabilize the structures around which the most significant dimensions of the self were organized, are, from the perspective of the self's developmental logic, not disproportionate. They are precisely proportionate. The magnitude of the challenge corresponds to the magnitude of the development it is designed to produce. The challenge that targets the career targets it, because that is where the ego's one-sidedness, the complex that needs resolution, the dimension of the self that needs to be freed from its current organization, has been located and protected. The challenge that arrives in the most important relationship arrives there for the same reason. The biggest challenges in a person's life tend to be the biggest precisely because what they are designed to access is the deepest. The alchemical image of the nigredo, the darkening, the dissolution, the breaking down of the existing substance into its essential components, is one of the most useful frameworks that Jung's engagement with alchemy provides for understanding what the phase of greatest challenge actually is. The alchemists who developed this symbolic language understood in their own idiom that the production of something genuinely new required first the dissolution of what was already formed, that you could not transmute what you had not first broken down. In psychological terms, the period of greatest challenge is the nigredo, not the failure of the transformation, but its necessary first phase. The dissolution of the existing structure, the loss of the familiar orientation, the breakdown of what was relied upon, the dark period in which nothing seems to be working, is not evidence of the transformation going wrong. It is evidence of it proceeding. And here is what the Jungian framework reveals about this moment, the moment of the greatest challenge that changes everything about the relationship to it. The darkness of the nigredo is not simply what must be endured before the transformation arrives. It is the transformation already in motion. What is being dissolved is precisely what needs to be dissolved. And the moment the dissolution reaches its furthest point, the moment the challenge feels most complete, most overwhelming, most total, is also the moment the turning begins. If this is landing, if this is the framework you have been looking for to make sense of what you are in, write in the comments. My biggest challenge is becoming my biggest breakthrough. That is not wishful thinking. In the framework we are building together, it is a description of what is structurally already happening. The concept of enantiodromia, drawn by Jung from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus and developed into one of the central principles of Jungian psychology, describes a phenomenon that is directly relevant to understanding the relationship between biggest challenges and biggest breakthroughs. Enantiodromia is the tendency of any extreme condition to eventually produce its opposite, the principle that any force, when it reaches a sufficient extreme, generates the conditions for its own reversal. In the psychological context, this means that the period of greatest difficulty, greatest challenge, greatest pressure on what the existing configuration can hold, is simultaneously the period in which the conditions for the most significant positive development are being most fully generated. The extremity is not opposed to the breakthrough. The extremity is what the breakthrough is built from. The timing of serious challenges, the way they arrive at specific moments in the life rather than at others, the way they seem to target particular phases rather than being evenly distributed, is not random in the Jungian framework. The challenge arrives when the existing configuration of the ego has reached a developmental ceiling, when the level of development currently achieved has produced everything it can produce, when the next significant development cannot be initiated from within the existing structure, when what the self requires of the individuation can only be accessed through a disruption that the ego would not, given the choice, voluntarily initiate. The challenge is, in this sense, precisely timed, not by external circumstance, but by the internal developmental logic of the self, which initiates the conditions for the next phase when the current phase has run its necessary course. Psychic energy, what Jung called libido in a broader sense than Freud intended, follows consistent laws within the psyche, and one of the most important of these laws concerns what happens to the energy that is concentrated by a serious challenge. When the normal channels through which psychic energy has been flowing, the established patterns of work, relationship, self-expression, and daily engagement are blocked or disrupted by a challenge of sufficient magnitude, the energy does not simply dissipate. It accumulates, it concentrates at the site of the disruption, and this concentration, which is experienced as the pressure and intensity of the challenging period, is simultaneously the accumulation of the psychic fuel that the breakthrough will require. The energy of the challenge does not become the energy of the breakthrough despite being the same energy. It becomes it because it is the same energy, concentrated, redirected, and released at the moment the turning occurs. Enantiodromia is the mechanism that makes the relationship between biggest challenges and biggest breakthroughs not merely a hopeful pattern, but a structural one. When a challenge has been genuinely engaged, when it has been inhabited rather than only endured, when the interior dimensions it activated have been worked with rather than only managed, the concentration of psychic energy at the site of the difficulty builds toward a threshold. And at that threshold, the tendency that Heraclitus observed and that Jung integrated into his understanding of the psyche operates. The extreme begins to reverse. The pressure becomes possibility. The darkness carries the turning point within it. This is not metaphor. It is a description of how the psyche's energy dynamics actually function when a challenge has reached sufficient depth and the individual has sustained the engagement that the depth requires. The transcendent function, Jung's term for the psyche's capacity to hold two apparently irreconcilable conditions simultaneously and allow a new synthesis to emerge from the tension, is the specific interior mechanism through which the challenge becomes the breakthrough. When the challenge is at its most acute, the conscious ego is holding two conditions that feel incompatible: the existing self-understanding and the conditions being produced by the challenge that the existing self-understanding cannot accommodate. The temptation is to resolve this tension prematurely, to force a return to the prior condition, to collapse into the new one before it is ready, to find any resolution that ends the tension before the synthesis has formed. The transcendent function requires exactly the opposite, sustaining the tension between the two until the psyche produces, from within that tension, something that neither condition alone could have generated. The breakthrough that emerges from a genuinely engaged challenge is not, in the Jungian framework, primarily an improvement in external circumstances. It is the emergence of a new level of the self, a reorganization of the interior at a depth that voluntary effort and comfortable development cannot reach. The person who has undergone a genuine psychological breakthrough is not the same person who entered the challenge with additional skills or corrected beliefs or an improved attitude. They are a person whose interior has been reorganized at a structural level, whose relationship to themselves, to others, to what is possible, and to what matters has shifted in ways that affect everything, not only the specific domain in which the challenge occurred. This is the qualitative difference between surviving a challenge and completing one. Survival leaves you with what you had plus the experience. Completion leaves you with a self that could not have existed without it. The ego's necessary humbling is one of the most consistent and most practically significant features of the challenge to breakthrough process, and one of the most consistently underestimated in accounts that focus primarily on the positive outcome. Before the breakthrough becomes possible, something in the ego's existing organization must give way. The certainty about how the situation would resolve, the self-concept that depended on circumstances the challenge has now disrupted. The plan for the life that the challenge has rendered unworkable, the identity built around the role the challenge has stripped. This giving way is experienced from inside as loss, often as devastating loss. But in the Jungian framework, it is preparatory. The ego that has been humbled by what it could not control has become, through that humbling, more permeable to what the deeper layers of the psyche have been attempting to contribute. The breakthrough enters through the opening that the humbling created. Jung's typological framework introduces a concept with direct practical relevance for understanding why the biggest challenges produce the biggest breakthroughs. The inferior function. For every individual, the least developed of the four psychological functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, represents not only a weakness, but a reservoir, a dimension of the psyche that carries the most significant unrealized potential. Serious challenges have a consistent tendency to activate the inferior function, to push the individual into exactly the territory where their least developed capacity lives. The person whose strength is thinking is challenged through feeling. The sensation type is challenged through the intuitive. This activation is uncomfortable, disorienting, and frequently the feature of the challenge that is most difficult to navigate. It is also the feature that carries the most significant development. The breakthrough that the inferior function's activation makes possible is precisely the development that comfortable engagement with the dominant function could not produce. The nigredo, the alchemical stage of dissolution, darkening, and the breakdown of existing form, does not last indefinitely. It has a completion point, and what makes the completion of the nigredo recognizable is specific. Not an external change in circumstances, but an interior shift in the quality of the experience itself. The heaviness begins to carry a different quality. The darkness begins to feel purposeful rather than only consuming. The exhaustion that accompanied the most acute phase begins to be accompanied by something else. Not energy exactly, not relief, but a quality of something having been worked through that is distinct from something simply having been endured. This shift is not dramatic. It does not arrive as a moment of clarity. It arrives as a change in the interior texture of the experience, a subtle but unmistakable indication that the dissolution has reached its completion and the next phase is beginning. The albedo, the alchemical stage that follows the nigredo's completion, corresponds in psychological terms to what might be called the clarification, the period in which what was dissolved by the challenge begins to reveal its essential components and the first indications of what is actually forming become legible. The albedo does not bring the breakthrough fully into view, but it brings the direction of the breakthrough into view for the first time. The person who was navigating blind, sustained only by the engagement with the process without any clear sense of where it was leading, begins, in the albedo, to sense a direction, not with certainty, not with the full clarity that will characterize the completed breakthrough, but with enough orientation to recognize that the dissolution was producing something and that what is producing is beginning to take shape. And this is the specific point at which the mechanism changes direction, the point that the Jungian framework identifies as the hinge of the entire process. Not the moment the challenge ends, not the moment relief arrives, the moment before all of that, when the turning has already begun in the interior before it becomes visible in the exterior, and when the person's relationship to what they are in is already fundamentally different, even if nothing in the external circumstances has yet changed. If this framework is landing in a way that changes how you understand what you're currently navigating, if it's making the challenge feel less like something happening to you and more like something with a structure and a direction, let me know by liking this video. That signal keeps this work going. The self, the organizing principle of the entire psyche, not merely its conscious portion, does not simply respond to the challenge that has arrived. It uses the breakdown of the existing structure that the challenge produces to create access to dimensions of the psyche that were not accessible before the structure broke down. What the ego's existing organization had successfully protected itself from, the shadow material that was being managed rather than integrated, the inferior function capacities that were being avoided, the deeper layer of the individuation that the existing structure had not yet reached, becomes accessible in the space created by the structure's dismantling. The breakdown is the mechanism by which the self gains access to what the ego's established organization was preventing. And what the self gains access to through the breakdown is precisely what the breakthrough will be made of. The distinction between surviving a challenge and completing it, between emerging from the difficulty with the previous self intact and emerging with a self that has been genuinely reorganized by the encounter, is one of the most practically important distinctions available in Jung's framework for the person in the middle of a serious challenge. Surviving a challenge means enduring until the external circumstances change sufficiently that the previous configuration becomes viable again, and then re-inhabiting that configuration as completely as possible. Completing a challenge means engaging with what the challenge activated, integrating what it surfaced, and allowing the interior reorganization that the engagement produces to become the new foundation rather than returning to the previous one. The completed challenge produces the breakthrough. The survived challenge produces the experience of having survived, which is not nothing, but is categorically different. What the psyche is building during the period of greatest challenge, during the time the ego is most fully engaged with the external demands and the interior pressure of the difficulty, is not visible while the building is in progress. This is one of the most disorienting features of the challenge period, the absence of any legible evidence that development is occurring. The interior work of the challenge, the activation of what needed to be activated, the dissolution of what needed to dissolve, the gradual integration of shadow material, the slow development of the inferior functions capacities, does not produce visible results on any schedule that the ego's planning would prefer. It produces invisible results that become visible all at once when the breakthrough arrives. And the breakthrough, when it arrives, will display a quality of preparation that was clearly underway the entire time, though entirely undetectable while it was happening. The consistent surprise of genuine breakthroughs, even when they follow challenges that have been genuinely engaged and in which the person was, on some level, aware that a significant development was in process, is one of the more intriguing features of the challenge to breakthrough cycle. The breakthrough tends to arrive with a quality of unexpectedness that the intellectual understanding of the process would not predict. This is partly because the specific form of the breakthrough cannot be anticipated by the ego that is undergoing the challenge. The ego does not have access to the full dimensionality of what the self has been building. The breakthrough arrives not only as the thing that was most needed, but as the thing that, in its specific form, the conscious mind could not have designed. Which is, of course, why the self, rather than the ego, was the one building it. The redistribution of psychic energy that accompanies the turning point, the moment the challenge reaches its extremity and the enantiodromia begins, is something that can be detected retrospectively, and sometimes in real time, as a shift in the quality of the interior experience. The energy that was concentrated at the site of the difficulty, held under pressure by the intensity of the challenge, accumulated beyond the capacity of the current configuration to absorb it, begins to move. Not in the direction of resolution in any ordinary sense, but in the direction of the new configuration the self has been building. This movement of energy is the internal signature of the breakthrough beginning, and it is sometimes perceptible before any external evidence of the breakthrough is available, as a subtle but unmistakable shift in the interior landscape, a quality of something releasing that was held of direction emerging where there was only pressure. The breakthrough does not hold, does not become a permanent reorganization of the self, rather than a temporary relief, unless the interior work it required is genuinely completed. What is integrated becomes part of the self's actual substance. What is acknowledged, worked with, and genuinely assimilated changes the structure of the interior permanently. But what is only partially engaged, what surfaces during the challenge and is touched but not fully inhabited, tends to return. In a later challenge, in a relationship pattern that reactivates the same complex, in a symptom or a circumstance that insists on what the previous encounter left unfinished. The integration that makes the breakthrough permanent is not dramatic. It is the patient, sustained interior work of actually taking in what the challenge produced, not just acknowledging that it happened, but allowing what it revealed to genuinely reorganize how the self is structured going forward. The relationship between the size of the challenge and the size of the breakthrough is not coincidental in Jung's framework. It is structural. The magnitude of what is dissolved determines the magnitude of what can be transmuted. The depth of the nigredo determines the height of the rubedo. The challenge that disrupted the most, that destabilized the structures around which the most significant dimensions of the self were organized, that activated the deepest layers of the complex, that humbled the ego most completely, produces the breakthrough that reorganizes at the deepest level. This is not a guarantee that every large challenge produces a large breakthrough. It is a description of the specific relationship that holds when the challenge is genuinely engaged. The depth of the engagement determines the depth of the outcome, and the challenges that felt largest were targeting exactly the development that could only be accessed at that depth. If you are in the middle of one of these challenges right now, and you sense that understanding the mechanism is not quite enough to navigate what is actually required of you in it, I have left something in the first pinned comment. It is for those who are ready to move from understanding the process to genuinely working with it. The approach of the turning point, the moment at which the challenge's energy is beginning to shift from accumulation toward inversion, has interior signatures that, once recognized, change the experience of the challenge entirely. One of the most consistent is the quality of exhaustion beginning to differentiate. Where the exhaustion of the acute phase was uniform and consuming, the exhaustion at the turning point begins to carry a quality of having completed something, of having worked through rather than simply endured. Another is the quality of the challenge itself beginning to feel less active and more complete, not resolved, but finished in its full expression. And a third, perhaps the most significant, the unexpected arrival of a new question, where previously there was only the pressure of the existing difficulty. The new question is the self beginning to point toward what comes next. The interior signals that a breakthrough is genuinely close, as distinct from the wish that it were close or the intellectual assertion that it should be, are distinct from the signals that characterize the acute phase of the challenge. The quality of sleep changes. The dreams, which during the acute phase often carried the imagery of being trapped, overwhelmed, or unable to find the way, begin to carry different imagery, of movement, of arrival, of beginning. Small things that were invisible during the intensity of the challenge become visible again. Moments of genuine lightness, flickers of interest in what lies ahead rather than only engagement with what is present. These are not dramatic indicators. They are subtle, but they are real, and they are distinct from the specific interior texture that characterized the challenge at its most acute. One of the most paradoxical and most important features of the challenge to breakthrough process is the consistent pattern of the individual feeling most lost, most without orientation, most uncertain of the direction, immediately before the breakthrough. This is not incidental. In Jungian terms, it reflects the completion of the ego's dissolution and the moment immediately preceding the breakthrough's arrival, the point at which the existing configuration has fully released and what is forming has not yet become visible. The person who gives up at this specific juncture, who withdraws the engagement, collapses the tension, returns to what is familiar before the new synthesis is formed, exits at precisely the threshold they had been moving toward. The feeling of being most lost is frequently the interior signature of being closest to the turning, a significant interior shift that tends to accompany the approach of genuine breakthrough, though rarely on any schedule the conscious mind would prefer, is the quality of the challenge beginning to feel purposeful rather than arbitrary. During the acute phase, the challenge is typically experienced as something that is happening to the person, an unwanted disruption of a life that would have proceeded better without it. As the turning approaches, this quality frequently shifts. The challenge begins to feel not comfortable, not welcome, but somehow fitting. The sense, even without any intellectual framework to account for it, that what is being navigated has something to do with what actually matters. This quality of felt purposefulness is one of the interior indicators that the self's work in the challenge is nearing its specific developmental completion. What a serious challenge requires from the person navigating it, beyond the endurance that is obvious and necessary, is a specific kind of interior engagement that is less obvious and more demanding. It requires the willingness to turn toward what the challenge has activated in the interior, rather than directing all available energy exclusively toward managing the external circumstances. The external demands are real and must be met, but the challenge is simultaneously producing interior material, activated complex content, shadow material, suppressed dimensions of the self, that will not become the breakthrough unless it is engaged. The person who manages the external challenge brilliantly while avoiding the interior engagement the challenge demands has survived something. The person who navigates both dimensions has completed something. The difference in outcome is proportional to that difference in approach. The temptation to collapse the tension prematurely, to force the resolution of the challenge before the transcendent function has completed its synthesis, is one of the most consistent obstacles to the genuine breakthrough. Premature resolution takes many forms, returning to the previous condition before what it needed to change has changed, accepting a solution that resolves the external pressure without completing the interior process, choosing certainty over the ongoing uncertainty that the unresolved tension requires. Each of these is understandable. The tension of genuine challenge is genuinely uncomfortable. But the function of the tension is precisely to prevent the premature closure that would end the challenge without producing the breakthrough. Holding the tension, remaining with the uncertainty, sustaining the engagement, trusting the process without forcing the conclusion, is the specific interior posture that allows the transcendent function to complete its work. The complex that the challenge has constellated, the charged cluster of emotional material that the challenge has activated from the interior, is not simply the difficulty of the challenge. It is also the specific resource that the breakthrough will be made of. Working with the activated complex rather than simply managing it requires a willingness to examine what has been stirred, what specifically has been activated, what earlier experience it connects to, what wound it touches, what developmental issue it is organized around. This examination is uncomfortable. The complex has charge, emotional intensity, reactivity, the quality of being difficult to approach with the equanimity that the examination requires. But the complex, engaged consciously, becomes material for integration. The complex avoided remains material for the next challenge, which will arrive with the same targeting precision as this one. The distinction between conscious engagement with a challenge and passive endurance of it is not primarily a distinction of effort or willpower. It is a distinction of orientation. Passive endurance is oriented entirely toward the end of the challenge, toward the external resolution that will allow the return to the prior condition. Conscious engagement is oriented toward both the external resolution and the interior process, toward what the challenge is producing in the interior and what that production requires of the person engaging it. The person engaged passively is waiting for the challenge to pass. The person engaged consciously is working with what the challenge is providing, working through the complex it activated, integrating the shadow material it surfaced, allowing the dissolution of what the challenge is, dismantling rather than organizing all energy around its defense. Among the things that most consistently delay the breakthrough, that extend the challenge phase beyond what the interior process itself requires, is the attempt to resolve the challenge at the same level of thinking and being that produced the conditions for it. Einstein's observation that a problem cannot be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it applies with particular force in the psychological context. The breakthrough requires a level of the self that does not yet exist at the beginning of the challenge, and the habits of thought, the defenses, the problem-solving strategies organized around the previous level, however effective they were in their domain, cannot produce what the breakthrough requires. Releasing the familiar strategies, the known frameworks, the established self-concept to allow the new level to form is among the most specific and most difficult things the challenge demands. Cooperating with the self's work in the challenge, rather than directing all energy toward resisting, shortcutting, or ending what the challenge is doing, is not passivity. It is the most active engagement available. It requires noticing what the challenge is specifically targeting, what in the self is being pushed, what capacity is being demanded, what dimension of the interior is being forcibly developed, and moving toward that development rather than organizing all energy around defending against the pressure. The person who notices that the challenge is consistently demanding flexibility from someone who has always depended on control, or depth from someone organized around surface, or genuine relationship from someone who has lived primarily in isolation, and who then begins to move consciously in the direction of that development, is cooperating with what the self has designed the challenge to produce. Serious challenges reliably stress the relationships in which the person undergoing them is embedded. The increased demand, the diminished availability, the interior preoccupation, the changed behaviors that accompany the challenge period, all of these affect the relational field, and the relational field responds in ways that can add relational difficulty to the existing challenge or that can provide the support the challenge period requires. What the challenge reveals about existing relationships, which relationships are capable of sustaining the pressure the challenge produces and which are not, is itself information that serves the breakthrough. The relationships that survive the challenge intact, or that deepen in response to the genuine encounter the challenge makes unavoidable, are the relationships that were organized around something real enough to hold under pressure. And what was real enough to hold is worth knowing. The body's experience during a serious challenge is not simply a side effect of the psychological and circumstantial pressure. It is a participant, a carrier of the challenge's effects, and a communicator about the process. Somatic signals during the challenge period, the quality of fatigue, the location and character of physical tension, the shifts in sleep and appetite and energy, are information about what is happening at levels that the conscious mind may not yet have registered. Attending to the body during the challenge, not only managing its symptoms, but genuinely listening to what it is communicating, is one of the practical ways that the interior engagement the challenge requires can be deepened. The body carries what the mind is not yet ready to hold consciously, and what the body is carrying is frequently among the most accurate indicators of where the interior work of the challenge is located. The role that solitude plays during a genuine challenge is not the same as the role it plays in ordinary rest. During a challenge, solitude is the specific condition in which the interior processing that the breakthrough requires can occur. The ongoing engagement with external demands, the management of circumstances, the responsiveness to others, the maintenance of ordinary functioning consumes psychic energy that the interior processing also requires. Solitude creates the space in which that processing can proceed, in which the dissolved material can settle, the new configurations can begin to form. The dream life can carry what the waking mind is too occupied to examine. The challenge period that contains no genuine solitude, no protected interior space in which the psyche can do its own work without interruption, is a challenge period in which the breakthrough, though approaching, cannot quite arrive. Maintaining orientation during the acute phase of a serious challenge, when the existing map of the self and the life no longer applies and the new map has not yet been produced, requires anchoring to something that the challenge cannot disrupt. In the Jungian framework, what remains stable through the disruption of every external and persona-level structure is the ongoing developmental logic of the self. The fact that the psyche is purposive, that the challenge is not random, that what is being dismantled for a specific developmental reason, and that the interior process has a direction even when its outcome is not yet visible. This orientation does not eliminate the discomfort of the challenge, but it provides the specific kind of ground underfoot that makes it possible to remain present with the process rather than being swept entirely off-center by its most acute phase. One of the most specific and most important dimensions of what the breakthrough requires the person to release, what cannot cross the threshold with them without undermining the development the breakthrough represents, is the version of the self organized around the conditions the challenge has dismantled. The self-concept that depended on the career structure the challenge disrupted, the identity organized around the relationship the challenge has fundamentally changed, the certainty about the direction of the life that the challenge has rendered impossible to maintain. These are real losses, they produce real grief, and the grief is appropriate. They were genuinely significant, but they cannot be carried intact through the threshold the breakthrough represents, because the person who will exist on the other side is organized differently. The release of the previous configuration is not the loss of the self. It is the prerequisite of the self that the breakthrough makes available. Creative expression, in any form available to the person navigating the challenge, however informal or technically undeveloped, serves a specific function during the challenge period that other forms of engagement cannot replicate. It externalizes the interior in a form that can be examined from the outside. That makes visible, in some form, what is happening at levels that ordinary reflection cannot fully access. What emerges through writing, drawing, movement, music, or any other form of making during the challenge period is frequently not what the person expected to find. The creative process during a genuine challenge tends to surface what the interior is working with at its deepest level, including material that the conscious mind had not yet fully acknowledged. And what becomes visible can be worked with in ways that what remains internal and unformed cannot. The interior posture that allows the breakthrough to complete, that allows the turning of the enantiodromia to fully invert and the new level to become available, is not dramatic. It is the quality of remaining present with the process in a specific way, neither forcing the resolution nor refusing it, neither collapsing the tension prematurely nor holding it beyond the point at which it is ready to release. It is the posture of genuine receptivity, of having done the interior work the challenge required, and then allowing what has been built by that work to emerge without the ego's interference. The ego's role in the final phase of the challenge to breakthrough process is to make room for what the self has been building, to release the control that was organized around what is being left behind, and to remain present and open as what was always coming begins to arrive. Day to day, the cooperation with the breakthrough process that the challenge period requires is not a series of dramatic interior gestures. It is the accumulation of small, consistent interior choices made in the ordinary course of navigating the difficulty. The choice to examine rather than dismiss what the challenge has activated. The choice to remain with the discomfort of the unresolved rather than forcing the resolution. The choice to attend to the body's communication rather than only managing its symptoms. The choice to maintain the interior engagement even when the external demands are most pressing. Each of these choices individually is modest. Accumulated across the duration of the challenge, they constitute the interior work that the breakthrough requires, and that no amount of external management of the challenge's circumstances can substitute for. The person who emerges from a genuinely completed challenge, who has navigated not only the external circumstances, but the interior process the challenge required, is not the previous person with additional experience. They are a person whose interior has been reorganized at a structural level. The ego is more permeable, the shadow more integrated, the inferior function more developed, the relationship to the self more direct. These are not incremental improvements. They are qualitative changes in who the person is, changes that affect how everything is encountered, not only how the specific domain of the challenge is navigated. The breakthrough does not produce a better version of the previous self. It produces the self that the previous self's development had been building toward, the one that the challenge was the specific instrument for making available. The specific strength that emerges from genuinely completed challenge is not generic resilience. It is precisely contoured to what the challenge produced. The capacity that the inferior functions activation developed, the depth of understanding that the shadow materials integration provides, the quality of presence that surviving and completing the dismantling makes possible. This strength is not portable in the sense that ordinary skills are portable. It cannot be transferred to someone else or acquired through any method other than the specific process that produced it, but it is permanent. What the psyche genuinely integrates does not reverse. The breakthrough's reorganization of the interior, when the interior work was genuinely done, holds, and what holds becomes the foundation from which everything subsequent is built. What becomes possible after the breakthrough, what opens in the life, in the relationships, in the work, in the quality of engagement with everything, was not possible before it. Not because the external circumstances have necessarily changed beyond what the challenge produced, but because the self engaging those circumstances has been reorganized at the depth the breakthrough reached. The person is now capable of things they were not capable of before. The capacity for the depth of relationship the inferior functions development makes possible, the vocational direction that the shadow materials integration unlocked, the quality of creative engagement that the dissolution and reconstitution of the ego produced. None of these were accessible from the previous level. All of them become available from the new one. The contribution that the person who has undergone genuine challenge and genuine breakthrough makes to the lives around them is specific and impossible to replicate through any path that did not involve the challenge. They carry the knowledge of the process from the inside, not intellectually, but as lived interior terrain. This gives them a quality of presence with others in difficulty that those who have not been through comparable processes cannot provide. The quality of genuine recognition of having navigated the same interior territory, of knowing from experience rather than inference that the process has a direction, and that the challenge is not what it appears to be from within its most acute phase. This is the wounded healer principle extended to the challenge to breakthrough cycle. The challenge completed becomes the specific resource for accompanying others through what it required. The breakthrough that emerges from genuinely completed challenge is irreversible in the same way that any genuine psychological development is irreversible. The interior reorganization that the breakthrough produced cannot be unproduced. The shadow material that was integrated cannot be unintegrated. The inferior function capacities that the challenge forced into development do not retreat to their previous undeveloped state. The ego's relationship to the self, made more direct by the experience of having had everything the ego was organized around temporarily dismantled, is permanently altered. What was built through the challenge and the breakthrough is located in the self, not in the circumstances. And what is located in the self is not subject to the same vulnerability as the external conditions that the challenge disrupted. What was always on the other side of the breakthrough, what the challenge was specifically configured to make accessible, was not produced by the challenge. It was waiting. The capacity that the inferior functions development unlocked was always present, undeveloped. The vocational direction that became visible after the dissolution of the previous structure was always there, obscured. The depth of relationship that the breakthrough made possible was always what the individual was actually capable of, held back not by external circumstance but by the interior configuration that the challenge was designed to dismantle. The breakthrough does not create the life that becomes possible. It removes the specific obstruction that was preventing access to what was always there. The challenge was the instrument. What opens on the other side was always yours. The courage that the challenge to breakthrough process required, and that was demonstrated without any guarantee of outcome throughout the duration of the engagement, is itself evidence of something significant about what the person carries. The willingness to remain present with what was dismantling, to sustain the engagement with what the process demanded, to hold the tension without collapsing it prematurely, to continue the interior work when the external circumstances provided no confirmation that it was producing anything. This is a quality of interior courage that cannot be performed and cannot be faked. It is demonstrated only through the actual willingness to remain. And what is demonstrated through the actual process of navigating the challenge is a permanent addition to the inventory of what the self is genuinely capable of. Jung was explicit in his understanding that the individual's genuine development, including and especially the development that the most significant challenges produce, is not, in its ultimate purpose, a private achievement. The person who has undergone genuine challenge and genuine breakthrough carries something into the collective that the unchallenged person cannot provide: a depth of experience, a quality of psychological reality, an earned understanding of what human beings are capable of enduring and completing. In Jung's framework, the development of the individual is the most significant contribution available to the collective. Not what the individual produces or accomplishes or provides as output, but what they have genuinely become. The breakthrough completed is a resource not only for the person who completed it, it is a resource for everyone whose life intersects with what they have become. The word biggest in the title of this video is worth returning to in the closing. The biggest challenges in a person's life are not biggest by accident. They are biggest because they target the most significant development, because what they are designed to access is the deepest layer of the individuation, the most significant complex to be resolved, the most consequential dimension of the self to be freed from its current configuration. The relationship is precise. The magnitude of the challenge is proportionate to the magnitude of what it is opening access to. The challenge that felt most total, most consuming, most capable of dismantling what the self depended on, targeted the development that the self most fundamentally needed and that the existing organization was most effectively preventing. That relationship is not a coincidence. It is the self's precision. The life that opens on the other side of the breakthrough that your biggest challenge is producing, the relationships, the work, the interior quality, the kind of engagement with others and with the world that the breakthrough makes available, is not a compensation for what was endured. It is not a reward for having persisted. It is simply what becomes accessible at the level the breakthrough produces. And what becomes accessible is, in every genuine case, more genuinely and more specifically one's own than what preceded it, more aligned with the actual self, more organized around what actually matters, more capable of the depth of engagement and contribution that the authentic self's development makes possible. The challenge was not a detour from this life. The challenge was the path to it. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "My biggest challenge is becoming my biggest breakthrough." And I've placed another video on your screen right now that continues exactly where this one ends. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.